Okay, so first challenge is to get the slides to work. There we go. So, as Per said, we are delighted to have Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kramer here today. And I'm going to start with 5 minutes just to put us all on the same stage so that you all understand before we start talking how important this prize is. So they were awarded the Sveriges Riksbank's Prize in Economic Sciences in Memory of Alfred Nobel 2019. So a little bit of the motivation is that we have seen drastic improvements in living standards in the world over the last 2 decades. This graph shows the decrease in the number of in the number of people living under the $2 US dollar poverty line. So we have seen this drastic decrease in the number of people living in poverty. And you can use other tables to see the same drastic decline in outcomes. So this is a picture showing child mortality rates. Amazing picture. In the last 2 decades, we have many more kids under the age of 5 surviving. When we look at maternal mortality, you see the same picture, drastic declines. And the number of people dying from malaria has been halved. And we have drastic decrease in the number of people dying from HIV. In terms of schooling, today, between 80 to 100% of all kids in the world are enrolled in primary school. Secondary school, also a nice upward trend, not as good as for primary school, but still a very nice picture. However, we are far from where we should be. So gigantic challenges remain. In the world today, every year, we have 700 million people living in extreme poverty. Every year, more than 5 million kids under the age of 5 are dying. And they die from diseases that are diseases that we easily could prevent. Measles, malaria, diarrhea, for example. More than 120 million children leave yearly school, primary school, without being able to read, basic reading, and without being able to do very simple calculations. So how do we best identify strategies to fight global poverty and help the least well-off? So that is one of humankind's most pressing questions. It's one of the largest questions facing the discipline of economics since its very start. And here is where the Economics Prize 2019 comes in. The award to the laureates is for pioneering an experimental approach to alleviate global poverty. So for their introduction of randomized controlled trials to the field of development economics, and to use those methods to understand causally what works and what does not work. By using RCTs, which is something you're going to hear a lot today, we're going to use the word RCT and not randomized controlled trials. By using RCTs, we can, instead of just looking at the big picture, how do we fight global poverty, we can break that picture or that question down into smaller pieces and then more precisely try to answer those questions. Over 2 decades, they have transformed the field of development economics, and by working with government organizations and setting up research centers, we are now to a much larger extent guiding policy with scientific evidence. So the Nobel discussion today is going to be from the beginning to the future. And it's with great honor and pleasure I would like to welcome the Nobel laureates, Esther, Abhijit, and Michael, up to the stage with a warm applause. Okay, let's start by pouring some water because we're going to talk a lot today. So, I am incredibly happy to have the opportunity to sit here with 3 people that I was taught about their papers as a PhD student. And to have the honor to sit and discuss with you about something that we're all passionate about. So I'm going to start this discussion by taking us back to what I think is the very start. So Michael, in the early 1919's, you were writing about big models, macro models on economic growth, how we, from 1 million years before Christ to 1990s, have seen the evolution. And then all of a sudden, Michael goes to Busia district in Kenya and start working on schooling outcomes. Tell us a little bit about where that started from and where that idea came from.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for the introduction. I was before I went to graduate school, I taught secondary school, high school in Kenya, and a friend of mine, I went back later after I was finished my PhD to visit friends, and a friend of mine was working for a small NGO, very small NGO, and they were looking for schools where they were going to start working, and they had a program that they put in place in other parts of Kenya, and they were thinking of putting it in place in this part of Kenya, but they didn't really know that much about what the impact was. And I suggested that a particular approach to try to understand the impact. But let me back up a little bit, because you asked about sort of long-run economic growth, and say a little bit about what happened in between. So I'd been interested in problems of economic development for exactly the reasons you outlined. You know, they're critically important to human welfare, and they're really the biggest questions in economics. And as a graduate student, there was a lot of interest at the time I was in graduate school in studying the determinants of economic growth, and a lot of that was happening in macroeconomics, and so I studied that from the point of view of macroeconomics. And trying to understand what some of the drivers were of some of the sorts of trends that you put up. And I think that macro approach actually is a very valuable approach. I don't see what we're doing as an, the two of you may have slightly different takes on this. I don't see this as one or the other. I think that both are important. But I'd actually started out from a more micro perspective, and because I had a job, I could afford to go back to Kenya, went back on vacation, looked up my old friends, and one of them, as I said, was working for this NGO. And I suggested if you wanted to understand what the impact of your program is, he was looking for 7 schools to start working in. I said, why don't you choose 14? And at least start in 7, and then as you can expand later on. But if you choose these 7 randomly from the 14, then you can go back after you've started in these schools, but before you've reached the others, look at how the children are doing, and you'll get a sense of whether your program's having an impact. Their program was actually a child sponsorship program, something that you see in some NGOs. The sponsors are given the name of a particular child, but the program is really for all the children in the school. And we learned some very interesting things from that program, but it was a pretty expensive program. They did all sorts of things in the school at the same time, and talking with them, it became clear that maybe it was worth experimenting with other approaches rather than just do everything and only be able to work in a small number of schools. Maybe they should try to think how could they spend their money most efficiently? And that might be finding the most effective components and working at multiple schools. So particularly since the results of their package, there were some issues with that, happy to discuss later. But then they started looking at textbooks, they tried a deworming program. And what we found was that some of these things, the things that had the most impact were not necessarily the things that we thought were going to be most effective. So they learned about how to run their NGO better. But perhaps more importantly, well, say, put it at 2 levels. The lessons that they learned, because they took the very courageous step of saying, we will have a rigorous evaluation of this, and we know that the results of this evaluation are going to be distributed to the world as a whole. That was something that could be useful not just for them, but for other organizations, and including ultimately for the Kenyan government. And we shared, one of the things we found most effective was treating kids for worms. We shared that with the Kenyan government. The Kenyan government, together with its donors, decided to scale that up. And and that was, they created a national program in Kenya. India, first state governments, and eventually the national government later followed. 150 million children are being treated as a result of those decisions of those governments. So that had a much bigger impact than this quite small NGO could have had on its own. And I think, ultimately, the broader impact is just this approach, which I think is familiar in business, and business tries to do it, which is to not just keep doing what you've been doing before, but to systematically experiment, try and find new ways of doing things, then try to test those ideas. Don't assume that it's going to work because it makes a lot of sense and you think it's going to work and you're emotionally invested in whether it's working. Actually test it. And then find something that works, refines it, keep improving it, keep testing adjustments to it, and then having that culture of continuous improvement in place can make a huge difference, whether it's for a business, for an NGO, or ultimately for a government.
So one thing that comes to my mind when you say this, so you said they had 7 schools where they wanted to try this out, and then you said, why don't we add 7? And then we randomize who gets it. So where did you come up? Like the common way to do things at that point in time, I think,
right,
was to just look at those 7 that did get it and those 7 that didn't get it. Why did you suggest to randomize? How did that come into your picture?
So, in fact, I think the common way to do things would have been to choose the 7 schools that were most convenient to their office. They had certain criteria for which schools they wanted. They didn't want to work with the richest schools in the area. They wanted some of the poorer schools. But there were many schools they could have worked with. And it might have been just schools that were convenient to their office, that were on the road, or a place where a friend was working, or something like that. But they found a set of schools that met their criteria. They had a set of criteria. But within that set, the reason for randomizing, let me give so they had a child sponsorship program. Imagine that they had chosen, if we were trying to understand the impact of the program, let's say they'd used any of several sensible criteria. Imagine they said, we're going to choose what I think they probably would have done, the ones that were on the road and easy to reach. And imagine they'd gone back and they'd found that those schools were doing better. Well, would it really have been because of the program? Or would it be because the areas near the road are doing better? It's easier to get inputs, it's easier to sell your output, it's easier to get to the hospital, it's easier to, there are all sorts of reasons why people who live near the roads are going to be doing better. I'm sure if we looked within Sweden and we compared the areas that are less remote and more remote, we'd see that the more remote areas are probably not doing as well. So that would have given a biased picture. Imagine that they'd done something else. Imagine they'd searched for the very poorest schools and then compared those to the others. Again, they would have been given a misleading picture of the results. And many NGOs would be very happy to get a misleading picture of the results. I don't want to, but I have to give them a lot of credit. They were saying, no, we're going to choose our treatment group and our comparison group as in a medical trial, and we're going to find out what the impact of our program is. And that's really the argument for not just experimenting, but doing it systematically, thinking ahead what the comparison group's going to be, and trying to choose that comparison group to be as similar to the treatment group as possible. And happy to discuss the technical details if people want, but basically randomization is a pretty good way to do that. There are other approaches as well.
I think Martina is asking a history of science question, not a science question. She wants to know how you knew, or they knew, or to randomize that, how that came up.
Well, this is something that, so there, okay, thank you. There was a lot of concern in economics at the time that basically, typically in economics, we have an existing data set from a census or from a survey of firms, and we spend time trying to analyze that data to try to deal with all of these factors that I mentioned. You try to control for distance to the road. You run a statistical test and you put a variable in there to isolate, you hope to pick up the effective distance from the road. But then, have you actually done it correctly? Or maybe what matters is not the kilometers you are from the road, but maybe it's different if maybe being 1 kilometer from the road versus 2 doesn't matter, but being 10 kilometers does. You've never known if you've done that exactly correctly. And you have to make a bunch of statistical judgments. And what we were finding, economists, if I can give ourselves some credit, we tend to be pretty clever. In fact, we tend to be too clever. And, a typical economics seminar was, and to a large extent still is, somebody saying, okay, here's how I dealt with the problem. And then other people say, oh, what about this problem? What if it was like this? Maybe you're not doing it right. And you have these endless discussions, which are fun, but you never know whether you got it right. And what we found was that I think what we saw in economics was each time people came up with a better technique for doing this, the answers to some pretty fundamental questions would start changing again. Mm-hmm. And we realized these other approaches weren't really working. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, I guess I would say two things. First, we knew that in other disciplines, medicine, for example, but not just medicine, in general in science, many sciences, not astronomy, but many sciences are able to do experiments, and we know that can be incredibly productive. So we thought we'll try and do that. But the other thing is, there were some precedents within economics. And without going into too much history of thought here, the U.S. did a couple of very large experiments in the 1970s, and we learned some things from those, but those tended to be isolated one-off experiments. The approach and then actually around the same time, Mexico, which I'm very pleased that we got the prize, but I can think of many other people who deserve credit. You had to pick somebody, so I'm very pleased you chose us. But the government of Mexico did this amazing, very large-scale randomized trial, looking at a program to replace a lot of their anti-poverty programs with cash to poor people. And they found if they sent their kids to school and got basic health care. So that was another thing. I wasn't aware of that they were doing that at the time, but I was aware of these programs in the 1970s and some job training programs. I think the innovation that made a difference was we were actually just a technical thing. We were working with very small NGOs on very small budgets, and we had to innovate, and we had to say, okay, look, there's 7 schools here. We're going to just do it anyway. And then that sort of set a precedent, which meant we could iterate over time. And many I got involved in many studies, but many other people started getting involved in studies, in many other studies in Kenya, and then other studies in India, and this took off. And then that iterative approach, this became something that people were doing collectively. From any one study, you couldn't learn that much, but as you built up results over time, then you could get a picture of things.
So one of the things, as Michael said, that he found was that, for example, textbooks didn't work. He also tried a lot of other inputs. And what we know is that one thing we know about developing countries and classrooms is that there are massive differences in learning levels within one classroom. Huge challenges for the teacher to teach someone who can't read and someone who can read very well. A lot of these programs that you have evaluated have created a lot of policy impact. One of the first experiments that you guys then did has had massive policy impact after that, and it's related to these differences in learning levels. So tell us a little bit about your beginning, Esther and Abhijit. someone has to speak.
I guess it's my beginning because Abhijit was involved in one before that, so it's my first proper randomized control trial. I was also involved started getting involved roughly at the same time in looking at the impact of women in policymakers, but that was more using existing randomized variation. So actually my first exposure to the idea of randomized control trial was from sitting in their development class while this was happening, and also at some point being in India, working with Abhijit on the software industry and getting a little bit, it was an exciting project, but I was getting quite bored in Bangalore. And Abhijit invited me to visit the experiments that they were doing on cutting class size in half in Rajasthan, and meeting the NGOs, and I was just kind of tagging along, doing nothing in particular, but it was forging some long-lasting friendship and interest. But my first project doing randomized control trial, I started as soon as I got a job that I got into that, because I really thought this was like, as Michael said, in my dissertation I was working with natural experiment, and every single of my paper, being a student of George Angrist, who is really one of the pioneers and helped us think about how do we think about causal effects, and how do we distinguish causal effects from correlations. And he is also a good writer, and I got my beginning in writing and basically copying down all his papers and then replacing his word by my word, which I strongly advise for any graduate student as an excellent way to write your first paper, is take a paper by someone you like and replace their word by your word. It's not plagiarism, it's how you learn. Anyway, any single of Josh's papers, and therefore my paper, was starting with saying the ideal way to answer this, say, to know the effect of education on wages would be to randomly assign education, but we cannot, and therefore we do blah, blah, blah. And I was like, what, we cannot? Like, they're doing it. I'm just like, cut to the chase. I'm not doing anything else. And we got our first, I got my first chance when we met Pratham. The Pratham founders had visited Abhijit, then we met them in Bombay. If you're interested in the beginning of this story, from their perspective, Rukmini Banerjee, who is now the head of Pratham, and was there in the meeting, as a very, very interesting retelling of that entire collaboration from her point of view. And I think it's very interesting to understand the back and forth. Anyway, we started working with them there, and we, as it was, they already had a program. We didn't come up with the program. They already had something they were doing, and they were kind enough to let us work with them to evaluate the program, even though at least Rukmini candidly acknowledged she was quite skeptical about what we were about. And their program was a program of remedial education. So the idea with them was not about input, was about, if you're starting with a situation where many kids are in grade 3 or 4 without knowing to read, then they cannot cope with the curriculum. And one of the thing that is common to many developing countries is the curriculum is very advanced. And so their initial program that we evaluated was a pull-out program, where they took out the 20 lowest performing kids in the class for 2 hours in a day, and put them with a volunteer who was teaching them, who are going back to the basics. And we evaluated this program over 2 years, epic 2 years. Over these 2 years in Baroda, there was an earthquake and a series of riots. So in both cases, the experiment was cut short, and we had a lot of learning on how to run experiments as well. For example, the first time we tried to test the kids, the classes came back, and the teachers had written the answer on the blackboard. So all of the kids had the same answer. In one classroom, they had all the same name. So where we realized that that
Extensive copying.
So there is a lot of learning that happened in these early years about these things, how these things are working. And in the same time as we were doing this remedial education, we also evaluated kind of the ancestor of computer-assisted learning. They had computers in Baroda. We discovered by chance they had computers in Baroda, but they weren't taking them out of the boxes. Because as it's often the case in developing countries, I've seen that in Kenya, I've seen that in India, I've seen that in Morocco, it is safer to keep the books and the computers in the locker, because otherwise the kids might disturb them or tear them. So we kind of, I think Sean Cole who was working with us on the project, is the one who kind of discovered those machines and said we should do something with those machines. And we took them out of the boxes and loaded them with very, very simple software. But in a sense, the software was another way to get at the same, possibly at the same problem, because you can, in a very rudimentary way, you can graduate the learning. So we used existing software, but starting games, very rudimentary games. One involved shooting trash into space at some point as a reward for for doing additions. So kids were doing 2 hours of computer sharing, very, very limited, 2 hours per week on shared computers on this very, very simple game. So we evaluated the two things together in Baroda, and then we did a similar program in Bombay. And we found very positive effect of the remedial education program only for kids who had benefited from it. Not importantly, for the 20 kids who were the highest performing kids who stayed with the regular teacher. So there were kind of two findings just there. One is that just cutting the class size was insufficient, and this echoed what they had found in the experiment they had done in Rajasthan, where they had cut the class size in two and they didn't find an effect. And so they had huge effect on the lowest performing kids, but no effect of just cutting the class size. So you really had to use the class size to change the pedagogy. And then we also had very positive effect, and this time on everyone, on this rudimentary computer-assisted learning. So this kind of, this combined with the textbook finding where Michael had found an effect, no effect on average, but an effect on the highest performing kids, slowly, little by little, started really gelling, also with I think the intuition that the Pratham people had and in their own experience in the field, that it had to be something about the adequacy of the curriculum and where the kids were, and that what was important is to adjust the teaching to the level of the kids that they had in front of them. So after that, there were many experiments by many other people which kind of progressively got into led to the same conclusion. What is important is finding a way to teach at the right level. And it can be done in any number of ways. It can be done, we did it in Kenya by tracking the kids for a period of time. It can be done with the Pratham techniques of frequent testing and reassessment. It can be done like Abhijit, who's sitting here, has done with others, including Kartik Muralidharan, by a more sophisticated version of the computer-assisted learning, targeting questions to the precise level of the kids. And that illustrates, I think, one of the important feature of experiments, which is a constant back and forth between the evaluation of one particular program, but also the insight that you're gaining into what ails more generally, what is the more general principle at stakes, and from which we are learning both something about the theory and also something about the future action. People often ask about, what do we learn in Kenya that's useful in India? And that might not be the specific feature of the program. Obviously, you're not going to give textbook in Hindi in Kenya, for example. The specific feature of the program depends on the context, but it's the general insight that then gets embodied in a specific context. So I think Rachel Glenister, who headed JPAL for 15 years and has been a huge driving force in this whole movement, calls it globally informed insight, locally relevant application. And this is constant back and forth we learn from them. Let me hand it to you for the policy, for how we go from that concept to the policy, the journey from the concept,
I didn't
to you.
hear that question yet.
I think she asked.
So-
I think she
so-
wanted it. Yes.
Yes, so that's perfect. Esther and I talked before, and here now she's handing it over.
So I think the progression of this project, in a sense, went from, and it's this way, from a kind of a startling success, I would say, by the relative standards of this literature. These were very, very large gains, to kind of frustrating failure very quickly, and then there was the cycle turned again. At that time, I was on the board of some kind of board of a fund that was dedicated to education by the Hewlett Foundation. The Hewlett Foundation, when we presented these results, they were very keen in unpacking this and unpacking these successful results. And there were several pieces to that, and they were making, I think, very legitimate point that, you did all these different things. You introduced these, as I call them, volunteers, but in fact they were actually employees, but they were paid very little. They were paid in those days $5 a month, I think, and they had a high school education. Is it necessary that you get those people to do it? Is it necessary? Can you, for example, it'd be much easier if the teachers themselves do it. Why would you want to bring in outside people to do it? And is it enough to tell the teachers, look, here is the problem, here is the solution, do it. Or maybe they need some training, maybe they need some encouragement, but why do we need to have this kind of satellite system sitting on top of the existing system, where some people are brought into the school, the classroom is divided? Why would that not be the natural flow of the school? I mean, that was the question that they asked, and eventually they persuaded me and Pratham to be involved in an evaluation of an unpacking project. And the unpacking project was basically, let's do not one experiment, but many experiments. And this is one of the things that's actually happening right about then, early 2000s, that, we started to understand that, I think partly through experience, partly through the fact that few more people were convinced, so there was a little more funding available, that what you really want to do is do many experiments at the same time. The advantage of that is that then at the end of it, you have an answer and not a just one more fact. In some ways, you kind of have split the question into a series of questions, and you can start answering one part of it and another part of it, etc. But you do it simultaneously, you get closer to an answer, and that was a part of what we were trying to do these multi intervention experiments. And the one that they were basically encouraging us to do it, Pratham, as always, saw the value of it immediately and were willing to take it on, which was also not obvious, because in some ways it was directly telling them that you do things this way, but why not do things other ways? Why not integrate it into the government system? So the pieces were, just give the teachers the material to do this, the same thing, what these volunteers, or nominally paid volunteers do. Let's get them to maybe that's not enough. Then a second intervention was, let's give them the materials and give them some training. And then a third piece was, let's give them some material, give them some training, and add the volunteer. So just asking, is the volunteer relevant? And what we found, actually, is not, there was actually yet another intervention, which is just, let's tell the parents that there is a problem. Let's give them the tools of learning how the problem, how to measure education. Let's train people in the village the tools of kind of how to measure children's education, and maybe their parents then can figure out the best way to do it. So in some ways, it was a whole spectrum of experiments, all kind of run more or less at the same time, where we were, one possible hypothesis could be that parents are, they know what their children need. We just have to expose them to the fact that the children are not doing as well as you might have imagined. Give them a tool to keep measuring them, and then they will put pressure on the education system to make change. That was, in some ways, the most optimistic hypothesis, that you could sort of get all the change by just empowering parents, and all the way across to the other extreme, which is, train the teachers, train the parents, give the parents the information, train the teachers, give them the material, and pull in volunteers. So this was a whole spectrum of experiments, in a sense. And what was, I think, the rather disappointing learning was that nothing in this had any effect except one, which is when you added the volunteers. And the volunteers here were even less involved in the school system, sadly. They were actually, young men and women in the village who had some high school education and who were exposed to these results that the children were not learning very well, and who were inspired to do something. So they held classes in the evening, typically, for the children, and the children then, some of them came and some of them didn't. But despite the fact that a very small fraction of the children came, the results were actually substantial. So, the way you want to compare is always take the entire target population and compare with the entire target control population. But if only 13% of the target population shows up, then of course your chance of finding an impact is actually rather small. Nonetheless, it somehow worked out. We found an impact, and now we're really in the business of scratching our heads, because we had no, what went wrong. And I think this is where I want to connect back to something that both Michael and Esther said. I think it was very important for us to go back to the drawing board, but with a frame of economic theory. In a sense, it was the point where it was crucial to try to sift through these results and say, what could this be going on? Why is it that it's failing here and not failing there? And there we got one more clue. It just happened to be a small opportunity, and we did an RCT very quickly, where the teachers in one of the poorest states in India, Bihar, where the government was willing to pay the teachers a stipend for implementing the same program, the program of, instead of teaching, what Esther described, not teaching the curriculum, but teaching children what they don't know, but doing it in school during the summer. So instead of these same teachers, the same teachers who were failing to deliver the right education, but doing it in the summer month, 1 month, where they were paid a stipend to do this very different thing. And what we found was spectacular results. And that was the big clue came from taking that opportunity, because we were wondering about that, exactly this question. Is it that the teachers are incapable of doing it? Or is it that they were in the school system not really encouraged to do it? So when we did this, we got these spectacular results. Then I think we got the clue that it has to be that basically it's the teachers just don't have the incentive, or actually not even clearly the incentive, just the structure within which this is possible. You talk to them and you get the same answer, which is, why don't you use these materials? Oh, where is the time? We have to finish the curriculum. And then you start to unravel this problem. And where this took us very much was to say that, you know, in the end, if you want to do this, you can either do it entirely externally, and that was successfully done in parts of India, or you do it entirely internally, meaning you build it in from the top. You get the kind of the heads of the local area. They have to buy it. Everybody has to buy it. It cannot be that you tell the teachers, because the teachers are, you know, they are liable to their bosses. And if the bosses are not convinced, you don't get it. So in some ways, we have now kind of, Pratham has gone in both these directions of either entirely, let's just bring in a team, a kind of a SWAT team and do this quickly, or the opposite, which is let's go fully systemic. And there's in between doesn't work. So I think that that's sort of the long arc of this, but now we are working in the same idea of working through the school system by integrating it. Has been sort of tried out partly in Ghana and increasing in with more sophistication in Zambia. We're working in Nigeria and in Cote d'Ivoire. In a bunch of places we're working with Pratham to bring in these ideas into it.
So some of these experiments that we have talked about now, yours, has had massive policy impact. So as you just said, the Teaching at the Right Level program that Abhijit and Esther just talked about has reached more than 60 million kids in 11 countries. Michael talked briefly about deworming as one of the initial projects he did. That reaches, just last year, more than 300 million kids, and it's recommended by the World Health Organization. So these programs that they just talked about have had massive policy impact, and we're just talking about 2. So we have done thousands, or you have done many, but the movement has done thousands of experiments.
You have done.
I have done thousands, but we all have done many experiments in many countries, and I'm just talking about 2 and the policy impact. This is an important prize. Esther talks, you brought up a word, you refer to the method a little bit sometimes as we're plumbers. So we're plumbers, so we solve small clogs in the system along the way, which makes the process, or it makes, you know, the development more smooth once we understand what are hiccups in the system. But some of the criticism that has been coming to these RCTs are also, for example, you know, some of it is related to, is this economics? This is education. This is health. Is this economics? The other one is related to what is the fundamental question on how economic growth, that is the important thing for decreasing global poverty. I'm just citing now, that's not my comment. How is that interaction with the plumbing activities? So, yeah, so you're going to have 5 minutes to answer that one.
Since you took it in your lecture, you can...
Let me say a little bit and then pass it to... so I think on the question of whether is it economics, well, in the Nobel lecture, my answer was, if it isn't, it should be. Yeah. I mean, I think these are questions of fundamental importance to the welfare of people and to the running of the economy. If we give up on it, why would anybody else take it on? It seems to me that, and in particular, I think what the point I was trying to make in the Nobel lecture is that it has changed the way we actually think of the field of economics. And I just say one point there, which is that I think in economics, we often function at the level of things like human capital. The problem with the word human capital is that it's great when you write down a model and you call it H in a model, but it has no actual meaning on the ground. You know, when you say this country is investing in human capital, you say their education budget is whatever, $300 million, but it's spent on, some are spent on pencils, some are spent on textbooks, some are spent on teachers, some are spent on buildings, and each of these things is not a perfect substitute for the other, and indeed would not be unless you believe that the education system knows exactly how to use the resources perfectly so that the last dollar has the right impact on everything. What we've learned over the last many years is that experts, even people who I think are very well-meaning, often have exactly the wrong intuition at this level, at this very granular level. Is the textbook better than the extra teacher or the teacher's salary? On these things, our intuitions just, the economics field directly as a theory, sure, inputs are good, incentives are good, so teacher salaries are good, inputs are good, but that's sort of, which is better? And the theory will never give us real guidance there. We can pretend it does, but it doesn't. And so at some level, we have to know, but these are the questions at which, policymakers need to decide, and unless we think that there was somehow, they've intuited the right answer, which seems counterfactual, given all our experiences, I would say there's no way to do it. So it's economics. If you want to answer the question of how to build human capital, I think one thing you have to do is confront the fact that human capital is a complex composite, and that each piece of it is, some pieces are more important than others, and we need to figure out which one. So in that sense, I think there is no substitute for taking this question head on. So I'll stop there.
And then the question on economic growth and how that's the feedback that economic growth is important for global poverty, and how does this relate to the plumbing activity that we do?
If it's okay, let me say a little bit about, is this economics first, and then I'll try to get to the other one as well. Milton Friedman has a very famous essay called The Methodology of Positive Economics, and that essay really set a framework for how much of economics was done in the 20th century. And there's a short part at the beginning of that essay in which he says, it would be nice if we could do experiments, and maybe we could operate a little bit faster and make more rapid progress, but we can't do experiments in economics, so I'm going to move on. And it's not that much of a problem because there are a lot of other areas in science where we can't do experiments either, astronomy, et cetera. And then he makes the very reasonable, I think, correct point that if you're going to make we can't describe, our models can't exactly accurately describe the entire world as it is. That we need to make abstractions, and in the process of making abstractions, we certainly lose something. And so he then says, look, we shouldn't just be. There's some people who think we need to understand the motivations of every business owner, and we should go talk to them and understand how they do things, and we shouldn't just assume that they're maximizing profit and figuring out how the marginal, the equation for marginal cost and setting marginal cost whatever you need to do to maximize profits. It's too early in the morning for me.
2 minutes, Michael. 2 minutes.
I'll get to the point. So he says, look, basically what he winds up doing, and arguably he's putting in a little bit of, this is where he sort of sneaks in an assumption. He's saying, look, let's just assume that everybody's rational and that everybody is in fact, let's maybe even assume that everything's perfectly competitive. And then we'll see how well can we predict things. And if we can predict things well, then we should declare victory. Well, what randomized trials are doing is very different than that. It's not only getting at causality, it's saying, let's go talk to the business people, and it's totally right. We shouldn't just take what they say for granted, but we should try and think about that and use that as a bit of an input. And what we find is that we find out that a model that says people are rational, that doesn't do a very good job of getting at things. But Milton Friedman's entirely right. If we just say, people aren't rational, then we're back to just saying, okay, we have to ask them what each of their motivation is. We wind up with a map of the world which has everything in it, which is at full scale, which is useless, like the Borges story, famous story of Borges, like that. But the great thing is, we can now actually take other ways of abstracting the world, other than just picking rationality and perfect competition, and take the the theoretical models, for example, built up in behavioral economics, which are very precise predictions, also from very simple assumptions, not quite as simple as rationality. And we can run these against each other. And we can run them against each other not just in a lab, because then Milton Friedman would say, fine, people behave differently in a lab. Does it really make a difference in the real world? Well, we can look at real world contexts and then say, hey, for some of these, it does make a difference. And then we can say, then we can make progress, not just saying, well, we just care about, or we, you can make progress both by looking at the fundamental mechanisms, as a scientist would, and by looking at the eventual outcomes and trace things along the whole way. So I guess I would argue, consistent with Abhijit said, this is not necessarily the way we did economics before, but I think it is economics, and critically, it includes theory, but allows us to take a much broader set of theories and build them together. And I think that's I think people who thought this was entirely empirical, not about theory. No, I think this is very useful in theory. The last part, very briefly, you can, 2 things.
1 minute.
Okay, yeah, no, so I can do it in 1 minute. The last, you can both. I think economic growth is incredibly important. You can, that's what really drove the trends that you were talking about. I think micro improvements are great on health and education, and those are really, really important as well, but economic growth is clearly vital. You can understand things about each of the things. Some people think that corruption is really important for economic growth. Well, we've learned a lot about corruption. Some people think that the empowering women so that it's no longer only half of the population that's contributing to economic progress. Well, we can learn about the various strategies for increasing education for women, empowering women politically. There's a bunch of, you can learn about the impacts of different types of political institutions. You can also understand some of there are models of Keynesian models of macroeconomics. Those have certain assumptions in them or certain predictions, and you can directly test those predictions, which are not, even if you're not directly doing experiments on macroeconomics, you can, through experiments, you can learn about some of the ingredients of these theories of economic growth. So I think there's a lot we can do.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna end this. I'm not gonna end it. I'm gonna say something after this as well. So I'm just gonna say that when I listened to when the prize was announced, I screamed in my office. I have the students who are my evidence that there was a screaming. But one thing that Esther then said in the when they called you, they said the question. So. I think they asked, what are you going to do with the money or something? But then Esther said, so the previous French, there's one French woman who's won the Nobel Prize before. The first one was Marie Curie. And when she got the prize, she said, I'm going to buy a gram of radium. And I just have to go back and talk a little bit with Michael and Abhijit and figure out what our gram of radium is. What is your gram of radium?
Thank you. Another thing that we've been starting to say, I have quite dim recollection of that press conference because it was 45 minutes after having the news and on a little bit the middle of the night. But another thing we started saying soon after that, and we really strongly believe, is that this is a prize for a movement. I think we tried to describe today how the way the work happens is really by a multitude of projects. If you're not willing to talk about human capital in general, but you want to talk about every aspect of it, then it takes many, many, many experiments, and literally thousands of experiments by hundreds of people and researchers, and also the people who work with them. And so when we met, it was pretty obvious to us that the gram of radium had to be something about nurturing this movement. And one thing that we have been fortunate about is that a few years ago, Andy Weiss, who is the vice of Stiglitz and Weiss, having subsequently made a lot of money, decided that one way that he wanted to work he wanted to contribute, and in particular he's very interested in helping the poorest people in the world, was to draw as many people to study development economics as possible and to do good work there, and work that would be directly relevant to the work sport. So he set up a fund called the Vice Fund that was meant to help young people, graduate students and junior faculty, to finance their research. And Michael and Abhijit were involved in helping him setting these funds that was initially for a few universities in the US. And we thought that contributing to this fund would be the best way that this money could be used. So we decided to donate, to pool the earnings, to take the shared earnings and give it to the Vice Fund with the to allow for its expansion to people elsewhere in the world, in particular in Europe, and also including people in the developing countries, to finance the research of mainly graduate students and junior faculty. And we were very gratified and humbled by the fact that Andy Weiss decided to match our donation by a factor of 50, so he's going to contribute $50 million to this fund, which will allow over the next 15 years to finance, we hope, the research of many, many more people, like you guys, like some of you guys, we hope, to study these important issues of how to improve the welfare of the world's poorest.
So I'm not going to conclude, but I think that's worth an applaud. So now I'm going to conclude. That's amazing news. The movement is going to move on, and it's going to become stronger. I hope that I think I speak for the whole field of economics, at least the development economists, that I don't hope that you're going to do what I think many other Nobel laureates have done. You know, this is a lifetime achievement. So I don't hope that you sit back and relax and stop doing research because you just got whatever the biggest is that we can get in the economic sciences. I hope you take this as a platform to continue push in the same way as you have done. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to have you here. And now I'm going to leave the floor to Arian Tavasoli, the president of the Student Association, and he's going to surprise you a little bit, and I'm going to sit down.
Does this work? Yes? So, dear Nobel laureates, dear students, dear faculty, and honorable guests. On behalf of the Student Association at Stockholm School of Economics, I would like to extend our sincerest gratitude to you, Professors Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kremer, for coming here today and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. The prize you have received is an acknowledgement of the contribution you have made to the improved research of development economics in our global society. For us students, it is also an inspiration to see what great things can be achieved by studying economics. So on behalf of our Student Association, I would like to say thank you for your time and commitment to your research. I would like to thank you for the tools and insights you have provided students like me to better be prepared to continuously improve our society moving forward. And as a small token of appreciation, I have prepared some gifts for you guys. So I would like to welcome up my Student Association board. Firstly, we have the purple overall. Being a student means to be able to combine your hard academic work with good camaraderie and tight community.
Purple. Oh, thank you. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. I have to start
What's the
drinking now.
purple?
I'll explain the gifts briefly.
Okay.
You may sit down. Thank you.
Okay.
So, the purple overall. In Swedish, we have a term called studentikos, which can best be explained as in student spirit. The overall is a classic token of this expression. We wear our overalls whenever we can, and with every step in the mud, well, at most universities they do, and with every step in the mud comes a stain that is forever a memory of the great times we had as students. Therefore, the overall is never to be washed. As you do not want to wash away these memories. However, if you were to become a bit too dirty, you're always welcome to swim in it, preferably in a fountain. We welcome you to attend any banquet we will ever arrange if you're ever coming by Sweden, preferably wearing your overalls. Nextly, you have been awarded, well, of course, you have been awarded the Sveriges Riksbank's Prize in Economic Sciences in Memory of Alfred Nobel, which one could argue is cause for celebration. We often celebrate our milestones by throwing banquets for our students. And at the end of those banquets, there's a common drink which has its origins in the Nordics, the Swedish punch. And at SSC, we have our very own Handelspunch. So to honor you, I have gifted you 3 of those for you to enjoy in your home countries after this long stay. So once again, thank you very much for coming to our school today, and congratulations to your grand achievement. Thank you.